U.S. Senator Chris Coons. Good to be with you, sir.
Great to be with you again, Ian. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So jump right in. We are a few months into the pandemic right now. Record high cases, 9 states with record hospitalizations. President has dismissed those as embers. Every public health expert is calling for a more coherent federal response. My question to you is, if we're saying the Trump administration is failing to act, why isn't Congress stepping in?
Well, first I'll say that Congress has stepped in to the extent that we did actually come together 2 months ago and pass unanimously a very large package of relief and support for state and local governments, for hospitals, funding for testing, for the development of vaccines. But bluntly, Ian, the chaotic and uncoordinated federal response when it came to testing, when it came to PPE, personal protective equipment, when it came to just setting and keeping a standard, really rests at the feet of President Trump. The CDC puts out guidance, Dr. Fauci gives briefings, and then President Trump just bluntly ignores the advice of his most senior scientists and public health advisors. One of the things that has most concerned and alarmed me is President Trump's decision to try and withdraw the United States from the World Health Organization. I'm not even sure he has the legal authority to do that. So Congress has acted and will act again to provide relief, support, and assistance. But we frankly have failed to rein in the president's rambling and incoherent briefings and his routine bad example in terms of his public health practices. And that's frankly largely because Republican leaders in the Senate and Republican governors around the country have followed his lead rather than following the science.
He can't leave, not for a year anyway, so you're right about that in terms of legal authority on the WHO. Absolutely true that one of the positive moments in this crisis has been Senate, House, and executive coming together with the initial relief and stimulus. Everyone out there economically is saying we're going to need an awful lot more. The lift is only getting harder. How comfortable, confident are you right now looking ahead at the next month, 2 months, that we're going to get another $1 trillion plus? And what do you think that package looks like if it happens?
I do think we'll get another round of relief, if nothing else, because the headwinds for both Trump's reelection and Republicans retaining the majority in the Senate and for the economy are getting stronger and stronger. There are funds that remain unspent in programs like the Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses, but there are critical ways in which the PPP has failed to address some of the real concerns that I've tried to prioritize: access to credit for minority-owned, veteran-owned, women-owned, or very small businesses. And there's other programs like the EIDL or the Emergency Impact Disaster Loan that really have failed to get off the ground at all. I do think that Republicans, led by Majority Leader McConnell, are drafting this week and next week what will be the next package. And then there will be a week or two of vigorous negotiations with Speaker Pelosi, and Minority Leader Schumer and the White House. I think in the end, we will see some aid to state and local governments, some additional individual stimulus checks or relief support, some solution around the extension of unemployment, and some kind of a back-to-work bonus and support for training. There are a lot of other questions, though. Will there be relief for renters and for mortgage holders? Will there be relief and funding for schools to reopen in the fall and for daycares? If we can't safely reopen schools and universities, that's going to have a huge impact on employment and on the economy and on confidence. And then last, will there be any real federal coordination around a national stockpile and around distributing critically needed personal protective equipment and medical supplies at exactly a time when we are seeing not just the control of the virus, but the virus now exploding to the worst it's ever been in the United States?
Some foreign policy questions for you. First of all, I mean, all the headlines right now are about the reports of a Russian bounty plot to kill American troops in Afghanistan. You said that you wanted to make sure that Russia is made to pay a price. So far, pretty clear that they have not. Unlikely Trump is going to make that move. Is Congress going to, and what do you think is possible?
Well, first, I think it's important that members of Congress get briefed on what the intelligence is and what it was. One of the things that's really striking to me is that there are press accounts that the president's daily intelligence briefing, included information, critical information about intelligence saying that the Russians were paying bounties to the Taliban to kill American troops and coalition troops, that happened roughly a year before that became public. And President Trump spoke to Putin 6 or 7 times over that period. Even if we should somehow forgive that he misses or doesn't read or isn't interested in his daily intelligence briefing, how is it possible that President Trump had call after call after call with Putin while his most senior advisors and leaders in the intelligence community were aware of this bounty arrangement between Russia and the Taliban or other forces in Afghanistan? How is it possible that he wasn't ever briefed on this? I frankly don't find that credible. One of the things that has made me particularly focused on this, Ian, is that Staff Sergeant Christopher Slutman, a 43-year-old Marine Corps reservist, was a Delawarean who left behind a widow and 3 daughters. He was one of 3 Marines killed in an incident, a roadside bomb, that press accounts strongly suggest was caused by a Russian bounty. This ought to make every American angry, and this ought to make every American ask, what are we doing if we're not taking minimally responsible steps to know about Russia's adventurism and its aggressive focus on American troops? And what should a next president be willing and able to do to stand up to Russia using all the tools in our toolkit, from sanctions to cyber actions to other actions?
Now, since we're talking about foreign interference, let's move to the elections. During the impeachment proceedings, president's lawyers told you that foreign interference in an election not necessarily illegal.
I think that the idea that any information that happens to come from overseas is necessarily campaign interference is a mistake.
We've certainly heard in Bolton's book, for example, but also from others, multiple instances where Trump actively solicited political help from China and Turkey. I mean, at this point, and we know also the Obama administration's difficulty and weakness in response to Russian interference in 2016. Is the horse out of the barn for 2020 when it comes to preventing foreign interference in our upcoming election?
Gosh, Ian, I sure hope not. There have been plenty of warnings. I'll remind you, President Trump's own hand-picked Director of National Intelligence, Director of the FBI, lifelong Republicans, Dan Coats and Christopher Wray, have testified in public in front of the Congress that they fully expect Russia's interference in the 2020 election to be broader, stronger, more aggressive than it was in 2016. That's saying something. If we want to remain a democracy and an independent nation, we have to make it clear that it is illegal to solicit and accept assistance from a foreign power. We are leaving the door wide open if we don't take decisive, bipartisan action. But study after study has shown that there is a huge gap, that states need something like $3.6 billion in election assistance just to conduct their elections safely in a pandemic, not to mention defending our elections against foreign interference. Our elections are run by local elected officials who are responsible and accountable. But we don't ask them to be responsible for defending their states and counties against a Russian missile attack or a Russian jet fighter attack. Why should we expect them to fully fund an expense against a GRU cyber attack against our election? We should be standing up and supporting it with both statute and funding.
So a lot of that money you're talking about is not just in terms of foreign interference, that $3.6 billion, a lot's to expand vote by mail, expand early voting. We've heard from the Trump administration, this is how elections get stolen. They shouldn't be allowing it. If people can show up for Black Lives Matter protests, they should be able to show up and vote. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I just voted by mail in Delaware's Democratic primary for the presidency. And one of the things that we've had a series of steering committee briefings and meetings on with secretaries of state, with state party leaders, both Democrat and Republican, is that it is possible to safely vote by mail. President Trump votes absentee by mail in every election. Hundreds of thousands of America's diplomats, development professionals, and armed forces members vote absentee by mail remotely in every election. I would suggest that there is going to be a lot of need for election security machinery and systems if we're going to have greater and greater vote by mail going forward, not because voting by mail is inherently any less secure, but because 40 states have very modest vote by mail. So in order to count the ballots, print the ballots, pay for the postage, you do have to have appropriations. And there are 5 states right now that for years have conducted most of their elections by mail, including blue states like Oregon and red states like Utah. They do it election after election, safely and securely.
You're a top advisor of the Biden campaign. You're there in Delaware, a favorite son. When it comes to foreign policy, can you boil it down in kind of a quick nugget or two, what the Biden Doctrine you think ends up looking like?
I think the Biden Doctrine is neither America first, which is ultimately America alone, nor America the world's policeman. I think it is a mischaracterization of the Obama-Biden foreign policy for President Trump to say that we were picking up the tab and fighting the world's wars and that we were disrespected. In fact, I think largely the opposite. The United States benefited significantly from the global network of close alliances with leading free and open societies that we built over the 7 decades since the Second World War. And so NATO, I think, is a critical part, not just of our strategic infrastructure, not just to help keep us safe, but to give us access through the EU to markets and to opportunities, to support and significantly strengthen the alliances between countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, the United States, that have a shared framework of common values.
One of Obama-Biden's biggest strategic pieces of outreach was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, going to be 40% of the global economy. Obama couldn't quite get it done. Trump leaves it. Do you think Biden picks it up and says, I want back in if he becomes president?
I don't know. But I do think that re-engagement with our allies in the Pacific, restarting critical conversations about how do we set standards for conduct of all kinds, whether it's freedom of navigation or it's in the commercial space. How do we set standards for conduct that we all collectively expect China to meet or push back on China's failure to meet? If we don't engage, if we don't show what high standards look like, then I frankly think we are ceding to the Chinese the standard setting and the leadership role in the emerging parts of the world.
What do you think the biggest lesson that Biden and the campaign should be to take from Hillary's defeat?
Well, look, this is not meant to be disrespectful in any way of Secretary Clinton, who I think was very bright, very capable, and had a very strong policy agenda. We're in a different environment in 2020. In 2016, we had a robust economy. We were largely domestically settled or stable. We were still engaged in long wars in Southwest Asia. But I think there were millions of Americans who felt left out and overlooked, who felt they hadn't participated in the recovery, and looked at Donald Trump and thought, why not? I can take a chance. What's the worst thing that could happen? 4 years later, they know what the worst thing is that can happen. It's happening right now. We could have a crisis like a global pandemic with a president who is utterly unprepared to lead and to manage. We could have a nationwide crisis caused by the brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis that could reveal the deep divisions in the United States rooted in race and racism. And we could have a president who not only fails to competently respond, but who cracks those divisions wider open. We've got millions of Americans who maybe were not convinced that Hillary Clinton was the right person to be the next president. They have got to be convinced now that Joe Biden's compassion, his ability to see our differences and heal us and bring us together, his ability to lead in America's best interest on the world stage, and the fact that for him, this election is not about him, it's about us, makes him the right choice in this context.
Senator Chris Coons, great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ian. Great to be on.